Hello, everyone. I'm here with Úrwiga, and we're going to be talking about how he came to the new right. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you.
Excellent.
So, perhaps you'd like to tell us where your political journey began, what sort of early influences there may have been, and at what point did this start to change?
So my mum was quite a good quite a sort of a practicing Christian as it were, and they're going to church a lot. So I think those very early Christian values were sort of with me from ever since I can remember. Um, my dad wasn't too religious actually, but I think he was still quite sort of conservative. So I think that background is what set me up for that. Really, I think. Yeah. So that's like the origin of it all. And I don't think I've really strayed away, certainly from social conservatism. Um, I think what changed. I think there's sort of several points at which I had sort of big shifts. So I grew up in a non-denominational household where we sort of went to whichever church was nearby, and I eventually, because I went to a Catholic school, I switched to Catholicism. I converted. Um, so that was a shift. I sort of did that because I felt that I wanted like a sense of belonging, and I felt that the Catholic Church was less. I saw like the Anglican Church, for example, sort of very much seeking public opinion and sort of changing. Um, I thought actually no, I was something that's actually quite resolute, for example. So yeah, I joined the Catholic Church. And also, I was working in London in my work experience week, well, 2 weeks, around the time of the Brexit vote, and I think that's probably I think that's like the biggest fundamental shift where actually I realised how
Yeah,
important this was.
I'd not been to London for a little while. I'd gone to Camden and that sort of area with my
Mm-hmm.
friends a couple of times, with school, that sort of thing. But
Absolutely.
I'd not been in a while when I went to go and see Adam Wallace give a talk at in Soho,
Right.
and I remember the chilling red pilling effect there. I mean, I was already red pilled, but
Mm.
I got the feeling that had I not been red pilled, I would have at least come to the conclusion that something was drastically wrong, right? When you're
Yeah.
walking down the street, it's visibly, it was visibly less white than I remembered it. Frankly, it
Yeah. I
was.
mean, I've been to Camden. It's
Oh no, sorry. I was saying I just went to Camden a couple of times with my
oh
mates
right.
when I was
Yeah.
in school, and then I think when I was 20 or so, how old was I? I think I was about 20. It was a few years ago now. I went to see Adam Wallace give his talk in Soho, and that was sort of the first time I'd been into London by myself, and so
Oh right. Okay.
I walked from Waterloo Station, I think, all the way to Soho just because I had the time, because I came straight from work. And
Right.
so I saw a big portion of the city there and I hadn't done that in quite a while. I'd maybe gone to a specific location here or there. And it was just so visibly different. The demographics, I mean, it was just very unexpected.
Hmm. I mean, I grew up actually in London in my from about the age of 5 to about 8 in North London, and I noticed even as a small child the demographic sort of shift as I was there. Sort of more people came into my school and so on. But we sort of lived at the very end of one of the tube lines, so you get into London very quickly. And I think sort of because coming from like a middle class family, I very much benefited from sort of all the very sort of multicultural sort of restaurants, and it took me a while to actually quite recently to sort of actually you know fully reject that kind of argument. Because obviously we sort of meet my dad after work and go for Chinese, and I think sort of it took a while for that kind of. I was very much aware of the fact that actually um, I thought that was like a good thing. That's what London was about, and it took me a while to sort of actually think no, that isn't the London that used to be, or at least to that extent.
Yeah, I mean, I recalled a memory I had when I was a very young boy. where I was sort of eating a hot dog by the London Eye with my dad, you know. And I mean, I was there earlier, actually, just earlier today. In fact, I've just come back. The exact same place. I was by the London Eye just a couple of hours ago. And at one point, actually, when I was sitting on the sort of grassy knoll area, if you're sort of facing the London Eye and facing the riverbank, you know, I was sort of just to the right. And I couldn't see a single white face. Now that's I don't think that's typical, you know, because I've been around sort of the you know, the sort of Waterloo area a fair bit, but it just goes to show that can happen on occasion, you know. And I was in Westminster a bit before, and you'd never guess that the city was majority non-native, you know. But evidently it is, you know. And I didn't go to like Brixton or Toxton or, you know, any of these areas that we might expect to see large numbers of non-natives there, where we would expect to see this great replacement. And obviously, when I've been to hotels and things doing trips for you know, for this sort of thing recently, you know, particularly in East London and places, it's just, you know, you can walk down the street and just, it feels like a foreign country, looks like a foreign country, and it's filled with the, you know, people who've come from foreign countries.
No,
London is no longer an English city.
Yes, no, I think that was always quite apparent, actually, that sort of there are a lot of people who were, I think I always thought it was quite weird. I think coming from a mostly rural background, it wasn't just like a racial thing, it was also like a very much a cultural thing. You got people sort of from all sorts of cultural genres, like all the sort of hippies and punk and so on, and that was also quite disconcerting. So yeah, I think it was, I always thought it was quite weird, but also, I mean, I do like London, and I go there quite a lot. There's a lot of things to sort of see and do there, but yeah, I think it is quite sad what's happened to it, and it's getting worse. Obviously, I think, you know, I think it's a lot worse than when I remember living in North London.
Okay, so there's obviously the demographic Redford of London, and you were on your work experience. What was your development?
That's more like the Brexit thing, actually, because obviously I was working with, I wouldn't exactly say where, but I was working in and around Westminster. I managed to get myself quite a good work experience placement, and it was sort of, everything was going up in smoke because of the Brexit. Because I was there in the 2 weeks sandwiching either side for the Brexit vote. And I remember before, everyone was very confident we weren't going to leave, and obviously someone who wasn't particularly political. Well, actually, that's not entirely true. I was politically active, but I wasn't too ideological. So I was almost swayed by the political argument not to leave and thinking, oh, crumbs, what's actually going to happen? Because I was just hearing all these people panicking about it. But I think I still kept my sort of, my old rural Euroscepticism. I would sort of always play the devil's advocate in conversations. And then I remembered as well, when we left, the family that I was staying with was sort of quite shocked, but also it's quite funny, actually, which it was. But no, I think it was just a sort of the reaction. And I think being part of at the very heart of it all when it was happening sort of changed my attitude to politics, actually. You know what differences these things make, and also, you know, I think the charisma of politicians as well, sort of, I mean, obviously being around Westminster, I sort of see them, and yeah, I think that shaped how I thought of British politics and so on.
Okay, so how would you describe yourself at this point? If someone had, you know, came up to you and said, "Hi, I'm an ANCAP libertarian" or something, you know, what are you? How would you maybe respond, if you were being honest, of course?
I always say that I'm Catholic and I'm quite patriotic. Well, I'm very patriotic, and I think generally, I think that encapsulates everything that someone can assume about me without being too specific. And also is quite good. The two perfectly acceptable labels in a sort of in wider society as well, actually. So yeah, I tend to go with those. Obviously, I'm quite traditionalist and so on. I think since ruralist as well. So yeah, I think those things go quite well. And obviously all the specifics within those will tend to apply as well.
Okay, so would you say that you're a Catholic first?
Well, I mean, this is the age-old debate as to whether your allegiance lies with the Pope or with your king. And it's not something I've actually managed to make my mind up yet too much on. I would say they're both divinely appointed. I think obviously my relationship with God is first among all things. But I think obviously the Catholic Church is a man-made institution, and therefore, if I think it is behaving badly, then I will put country first. Or rather, if I think that its actions are in contravention to my own country in a bad way, in which case it probably always would be a bad way, then I'd put country first over the institution of the Catholic Church. But obviously God will always come first.
I mean, that's quite interesting. That actually sort of sounds to me like recusant Catholicism, being when it was basically illegal. It wasn't illegal, but it's when you weren't really, it wasn't really tolerated for you to be a Catholic in the UK unless you were to be recused by the king, right? Yeah. Being Catholic, and this meant that you would agree to basically not, to not basically obey the commands of the Pope, if and when they, are contravened by the commands of the king.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Which, and by the way, I'm not a Catholic. I'm totally sure what I am, but my mother's side are all recusant Catholics, and, okay. Historically, and they've maintained very much the that sort of implicit assumption.
Right.
So I just found that interesting. Sorry, I wasn't really going anywhere with that.
No, I mean, this is interesting actually. There's a famous scene where John Henry Newman, who's quite a famous English Catholic, is at a dinner hosted by the Duke of Norfolk, who's a prominent Catholic as well. And
he's the leading Catholic peer in the realm. Yeah.
Yes, and he said he proposed a toast to the Pope. John Henry Newman, who was this famous sort of English cardinal, actually converted from Anglicanism, said, "I'll toast my conscience first, then the Pope." And it was very much that sort of sense of, well, yes, I am a Catholic, but at the end of the day, this is a man-made institution. So obviously, my conscience and God will always.
Okay, help me, and forgive this detraction again. I am just legitimately interested. Help me understand. So the College of Cardinals, the idea is that the Holy Spirit affects the College of Cardinals to allow, God's chosen representative, the heir to St. Peter, right?
Yeah.
And that once elected, he is no longer just a man. It's why they take on the new name, etc. He is actually, he's the word and the voice of God. He is the individual whom God has entrusted to mankind in order to guide the church, and he speaks on the behalf of God, right?
Yes.
And so, I mean, I very much like that you've taken on the sort of recusant, if we can sort of, if we're going to use that term, which I think is sort of fine. If we're going to go along that sort of, and I do think that is the more healthy outlook. I do believe that having loyalty to a prince bishopric in Rome brings up sort of weird, security questions. But, so I do think it's a good thing, and I'm very glad that you, from my own perspective, I'm very glad that you've taken up that sort of attitude toward your faith. But help me understand, is it not sort of the word of God? Does the word of God not come through the Pope and is the Pope not therefore totally infallible?
So the infallibility thing
possesses him, right?
Is a very interesting question. Actually, the infallibility clause that can be invoked is only on Scripture. If the Pope talks about anything else, he is not infallible. The Pope is only infallible in situations as outlined within the Catholic catechisms and sort of other legalistic documents of the Vatican City. He's not actually this idea that if the Pope says something and that's divinely inspired is not true. So, for example, if the current Pope Francis were to say something about the Gospels and deliberately invoked the infallibility clause, then I would say that to be infallible. But if he's talking about sort of economy or capitalism, then I'd say no, he isn't infallible, and this is him commentating on the political scene of the world as a human being. Obviously, he's there because God wants him to be there, but at the same time, like a king, he can corrupt. Not corrupt, that's unfair. He can make mistakes as a king would do under his divine right to rule and so on. So,
yeah, this is a conversation I was actually having about theology a while ago with someone, where we were talking about, because they knew that I very familiar with the second Borgia Pope, Alexander VI. You know.
Yes.
And my whole point was that I thought that he was a relatively good Pope, theologically speaking. You could argue the indulgences, but it sort of always existed, and you could always get bishops to sort of, send requests up the chain, and you'd be able to get divorces and things like annulments and things. Right?
Yes.
Not divorces, but, basically divorces though. They call them annulments, but you were able to get that sort of thing, and it wasn't available to regular people. So in a way, would the indulgences not sort of, my argument was always, with the indulgences not sort of the leveling of the playing field there. And, the idea that, and this is just one pope, but it's a good example because he's considered a particularly bad pope by conventional standards, and he's also the one I happen to know the most about. So, he had a mistress, right? Julia Farnese.
Yeah.
Now, but I mean, it doesn't say anywhere in the Bible that priests must be celibate. I mean, this idea was invented in the 15th century, right? During this time period.
I think, my knowledge of the early church is very much, I'd say, my knowledge of the early church is centered around actually the conversion of the English people, so people like Augustine. I sort of have blank spots throughout the medieval ages, so I'm not actually sure on the celibacy of priests. I'll say that now. I'm not actually clued up myself on exactly what it says and when that came into being. So,
okay,
I'll format on that one in particular. I think, I suppose, on the celibacy of priests, I think it's sort of a devotion to what he should be doing. I mean, it is an interesting debate because obviously, can a priest actually promote family values, or should they be doing that? Should there be a benchmark for that? And in addition to that, if they were family men, would that limit some of the sex scandals that Vatican's had? I mean, these are all very interesting questions, I think.
Yeah, I would agree. And there is of course the idea of these sort of contradictory policies from popes, right? Well, nobody ever said, as far as I'm aware, it's not written in scripture that the Pope, he can speak with the word of God, but there's nothing saying that, God means to give us an absolute sort of axiomatic truth for all times, right? He might be trying to give some sort of quasi-contextual truth, Right, there are these sorts of, theological sort of principles, which ideas, which sort of, I think, do away with a lot of the sort of the base objections to ideas like Catholicism.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think.
Oh, sorry. Please go ahead.
I think with Catholicism, it's very much a religion which was built for the purpose of mass conversion, and it would sort of morph itself whichever way it needed to do in order to fulfill that. Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's meant that obviously having grown fairly organically, it has no, I think, sort of this accumulation of rules. A bit like England in a way. You sort of have all these, you have this sort of these morass of laws and so on, which, you know, as history marches on, you know, things will contradict each other, and you sort of go back and find there's a law which allows you to, I don't know, shoot a Welsh person from Monmouth Cathedral with a longbow or something. You have to go back and sort of and change it, or it's already been nullified by another law. But it's unlike America, where generally you sort of like you amend what's currently there. I think it creates a very interesting sort of legal system, and also just I think sort of, as you said, you know, the various contradictions and the sort of the interactions that popes have with their sort of office. I think it's fascinating, really. But I think popes are in a way just a more, have to be careful here. I think popes are more like a sort of a king, like a sort of a special king.
I mean, historically, he is literally a king.
Well,
his Rex et
quite, yes.
King of the States, yeah.
Indeed. So yeah, I think I tend to treat it like sort of, I mean, obviously, divine right of kings. But I think it perhaps would have been better if popes were perhaps a bit more accountable to a sort of, well, the curia of cardinals.
Ooh, I don't know about that. It doesn't. I mean, I just don't see what the theological justification for that would be. You know, the College of Cardinals are but men. They're not bound to the Holy Spirit in the way that the Pope is after his coronation. Or so
indeed.
The theology.
But it's the same with the king. It's sort of like, well, at the end of the day, these are humans, and these are sin, and these are also men capable of sin. You know, the Pope still has to go to confession, for example. So, I mean, as I think people obviously argue this with me and so on, but as a conservative, I think one of our tenets is that there should never be a sort of an absolute power vested in one human within a country. There should always, or even any organization, there should always be a degree of responsibility and accountability. So, for example, whilst I think our current parliamentary democracy setup is obviously wrong and bad, I think the idea that you perhaps, for example, can't raise taxes without a sitting parliament, whoever those representatives may be, I think is a good notion.
It's a perfectly good law for the time in which it was created, I think, because back in the day, of course, the House of Lords, it was determined the House of Lords couldn't vote on money bills, right? Bills that monitor, but it's kind of subjective because anything could sort of be considered a money bill. But regardless, the idea was that they couldn't raise the tax. That was the Parliament's job, and so you would have to. There is this idea, sort of going down the chain along that vein, that the Parliament shouldn't be able to raise the taxes without the consent of the people. It's sort of it's sort of concentric rings of like responsibility and authority, sort of which align with concentric rings of accountability, if that made any sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
think it's that organic sort of creation of that contract between nobility and people, which is sort of, unlike most other countries, has developed. Generally, obviously, things like Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights came through a degree of conflict, but generally, this developed relatively peacefully compared to other countries, and also with a sense of sort of natural change as opposed to some sort of knee-jerk mass beheadings of the French Revolution and so on. So I think ultimately that is a good thing.
I'm not so sure. I mean, whether or not it's organic, I think we could probably go into that. But I mean, are you sort of under the impression that the sort of the governmental system, the way we have it today, is a good social contract between those below and those above?
I mean, obviously, today a lot of things have been obviously destroyed and morphed and so on. I'm generally in favour of having a bicameral parliament, whereby the people will elect a local MP to the House of Commons, who is one of the sort of, I mean, back then, the member the landed gentry, who I think probably.
Sorry, I think you broke up there. What was that about the landed gentry?
Yes, so essentially, sort of House of Commons made up of landed gentry.
Oh, okay, yeah, gentry conservatism, which is for those who don't know, is another word for high Toryism.
Yes, essentially, and then obviously the House of Lords. So I think in principle, what we have today isn't a million miles from what it should be. It's just obviously modern precedent has corroded what these institutions ought to be. So, for example, the House of Lords is hardly full of actual lords. They're sort of appointed peers of the realm, who, I'm not saying we shouldn't have peers of the realm, but they should be an exception, not general rule.
So, when you say peers of the realm, are you referring to people who are given life peers?
Yes, people who are given them. I mean, I think some people, I think for sort of very good, very significant achievements in service of the country, like sort of a very high-ranking general, for example. And yeah, I think that's okay, but I think generally, most of the members of the House of Lords should be hereditary peers.
Well, no, I totally agree there. But as far as I'm aware, don't get me wrong, some life peers are like failed politicians.
Oh, quite, yes. No,
but a lot of them are like admirals of the fleet, and that it's not a clear-cut thing whether or not that. I mean, I do think that the fact that some of them are just failed politicians proves that the system doesn't work. But I think it's quite interesting.
Are sort of fillers. So a lot of them are, if obviously a politician wants to get rid of a member of parliament, obviously you can't really sack them unless there's something quite bad, because they're being elected by the people. So they'll often just sort of
kick them upstairs.
Yes, we're quite. So let's get rid of them.
Which for those who don't know, being kicked upstairs used to be political jargon, probably still is, for an MP being given a peerage, and therefore that seat is then free for the party to choose someone else.
Yeah.
And he joins the House of Lords and therefore can't be in the House of Commons anymore. Yeah.
No, yeah, exactly. So what that's led to is a lot of, obviously, the Labour and Liberal parties did a lot of this. They just promoted all these people into the House of Lords, which used to be quite a conservative house. And now, obviously, those of you who've been following the news and have watched as the Brexit sort of legislation goes through that house, and they try and block it. And it's because most of the old guard of the House of Lords are fully behind Brexit. It's all the ones who've been used in sort of stuff it full of all the Liberal Lords, which is quite ironic in a way, how all these sort of leftist people take up peerages, but there we are.
Yeah, it's sort of champagne socialism exemplified perfectly, isn't it? But yeah, I actually agree. The only area of disagreement really that I would have is the House of Lords itself, right? So I agree. We should have an upper chamber. I think they should be equal in sovereign chambers. And yeah, I think that the vast majority should be hereditary peers, and those who aren't should be appointed by the crown. And I don't mean like you know, in deconstructivist quotation marks, you know, appointed by the crown, open bracket, on the advice of the prime minister, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, because really it's just the prime minister making that decision, you know. He gets to appoint, you know, bishops to the House of Lords because, you know, he won a popular election where everyone, yeah, basically anyone who voted for him is probably not a Christian, you know.
Yeah.
Or in many cases anyway, or he certainly didn't stand on a sort of a pro-Christian platform anyway. Okay, so my main area of disagreement would be basically like along the lines of, how to put this. Yes, it may have been organic. Okay, let's say I concede that point, because I don't think it's sort of that, you know, that important whether or not it is. Let's say that we do have this organic change for the United Kingdom, possibly starting with Simon de Montfort and Magna Carta, and sort of ending with, let's say, Blair's Bill, you know.
Well, I mean, it's not entirely organic, but I would obviously, I think in the context of other countries, I think certainly in comparison to most other European countries, if not almost all, and the rest of the world, I think it is the more organic.
I mean, I think Northern European countries have, you know, have actually taken basically the same route here. I would say that the UK has some similarities with the continent, and with the constant sort of the violent revolution, what's called the British Wars, you know, the English Civil War, and the Jacobite Wars, etc. Yeah, so, you know, you have the English Civil War and the Jacobite stuff. The, you know, William of Orange and become a constitutional monarchy, and then that power is sort of slowly eroded. But really, I mean, Elizabeth I eroded a lot of those powers. And what can cause this is the fact that we don't have a codified constitution where powers actually rest, you know, in places, right? We have an uncodified constitution where convention rules. So it's whoever people believe have the power that physically do.
Yes,
it's quite, which is why Parliament is like able to legislate over constitutional matters, you know, or over matters which, you know, by all rights are constitutional, you know. I mean, it makes no sense that the Parliament should be able to vote to restrict the royal prerogative, right? There's two different branches of government.
Well,
right?
yes.
But that's exactly what happened in 2005, I believe.
So, I mean, obviously there are some serious discrepancies with what has happened, but I think that I think the Bill of Rights of 1689 and the various sort of legislation that sort of came in that year when they offered this crown to William of Orange, they sort of packed in all this stuff for which they could limit the monarchy, and I think that's essentially the. I think whilst a lot of ancient rights and privileges were preserved for the people, and the king arguably did have more power than a monarch would have now.
Well, I mean, sorry, just a brief interjection there, just for clarity. So, I mean, historically, kings have had restrictions on their power, but they weren't physical restrictions.
No,
they were sort of implied or suggested restrictions, which is why kings could functionally exercise absolute authority if and when, you know, the system allowed for it. And what I mean by that is, if you have a particularly strong and powerful king, right, like Henry VII, who is just able to crush any rebellion from any lord who might disagree with him, or who might try to prevent his changes, you know, by raising an army, etc., then it, you know, then the system sort of fails to work, because you have
well, he's above the rule of law, essentially.
Yeah.
That's what you don't want, I think, and I think that's why essentially my stance is that no one in the country should be above the rule of law. That is established in the ancient sort of English common law.
And in the ancient monarchy.
Sorry, carry on.
Under the Anglo-Saxon system, obviously, you have the Witan, right? The Witaniamot. So I mean, you know, and I actually think that this idea of English Parliament going back to Simon de Montfort is sort of demonstrably not correct. If you look at the shires and the hundreds under the Anglo-Saxon system, it's you know, that's clearly the basis of the system there.
Well, yes, I mean obviously Parliament is a Norman idea, which sort of brings you back, I suppose, to this. I suppose the issue of Normans in England and whether they were sort of a good thing or not. I'm quite an avid Anglo-Saxonist myself, actually, so in some ways, actually, rather than they're not come, but well, I think it's like an interesting.
Well, I wouldn't be here.
Well, oh yes, I suppose. Yeah. I'm not sure if I have any Norman in me, or certainly none of the family names would suggest any kind of Norman interference. As far as I know, obviously.
I think it's out of my mother's great grandparents, 3 out of 8 of the last names are of the maiden last names for women, obviously. 3 of the last names are Norman.
Oh right, okay.
I'm not sure how many on my father's side. The history is less good there. My mother's last name is Norman, though.
Right. No, my family name is definitely Anglo-Saxon. It's one of those definitely Anglo-Saxon. The other ones, I think, we also indicate obviously either Anglo-Saxon or Welsh or Scots Gaelic names.
Hmm.
But no, I think sort of Normans brought a lot of things.
I think they particularly brought sort of particular amount of authoritarianism.
Yes,
because obviously the Duchy of Normandy was a principality that was originally supposed to be a lordship, right? It was just supposed to be a county, Normandy, in which the Vikings would be given land either side of the Seine Street to defend against other Vikings, and in exchange they would be given the run of that county because their chieftain, their war chief, would be the count, the local military, you know, commander, etc., the local governor, local hereditary governor, in fact. But the Duchy of Normandy was ended up they sort of pinched a county from the Breton, they pinched a county from the Poitevins, and they pinched a county from the Frisians. So as you have this sort of small inner sort of Normandy around Caen and Rouen, etc., where sort of Viking settlements and the progression thereof, and you also have these outer regions that have to be contained, and so the Normans start building castles. And they start investing, you know, they have their Viking warriors invest in sort of the best military technology of the period. And they're actually renowned for having the best cavalry of the period in Europe. Best cavalry.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And so it was a heavily militarized principality that was able to actually crush rebellions from within, which is something that you couldn't really do in Anglo-Saxon England. You know, you would have your supporters.
Yes.
And then those who oppose you. Right, and if everyone opposed you, or more or less, you know, or if a significant majority opposed you, then you would step down, you'd be deposed, you'd probably be, you'd probably be killed, and someone would remove you. It's sort of more democratic, whereas the Norman system is more autocratic.
Yes,
more authoritarian, and there's less of this idea of consent. And in fact, when the English went to elect William the Conqueror as their king, because he obviously won the Battle of Hastings. And conquered England. When they went to elect him, William, the Normans believed that they were attacking, right? That they were rebelling because it was such a foreign concept to them. What do you mean you're electing?
No, exactly.
He is your king. And so he actually attacked the Saxons, right?
No,
they went to elect him as king. But
I think
there is, I think, this traditional Northern European idea of, and more generally, you know, it's a symbiotic relationship between the Lord and his subjects. On the part of the subject, a certain amount of obedience is expected, and on the part of the Lord, a certain amount of protection is expected. That is the that's the basis of the
Yeah.
symbiotic relation. You can chuck other things in there, you know, and you know, but that I think is the relationship at its core. And it's perfectly exemplified in the military fashion in Beowulf, you know. But I think that we're actually seeing the lack of that now, right? We're seeing the lack of a paternal, you know, figure who is organically tied into the land and will feel the vicissitudes. So as the country increases in prosperity or decreases in prosperity, you will see, you know, the Lord will feel that himself, you know, through his own estate, right? Because he sort of physically owns it to some degree or another. And I think that's really what we're lacking today, which is why I actually don't see just going back to the House of Lords as being a necessary solution, because a worthwhile, a practical, a good solution, you know, because I mean, for one, that's the system we had not long ago, and it led us to this. That's sort of for one, and we could argue maybe that's not governmental, maybe that's ideological, but you know, just run with me for a second. If you, so I mean, my basic opposition to something, apart from the authoritarian nature of it and the non sort of hereditary nature, my opposition to fascism, you know, national fascism, sort of primarily comes from the idea that, you know, it's this fascism represents the aggregate of a nation, not its constituent parts, when it is the constituent parts of a nation that are the nation. You know, that like there is such a thing as Britain, but Britain is made up of Wales and England and Scotland and Ulster. And the Isle of Man, I suppose. So, like, you know, so riding roughshod over the interests of the Isle of Man for the rest, you know, isn't protecting Britain, because you've destroyed a constituent part of it potentially, you know. And so in this same way, I feel like a House of Lords, which is only accountable collectively for the nation as a whole, will perform that role, right, admirably, because they are tied into the land. And we could go into the benefits of sort of hereditary aristocracy in a bit, but you know, of just hereditary leadership and that sort of thing in a bit. But they are, you know, they will, I think we both agree, represent the aggregate interests of the country. They will fill that role. Now, my main problem with that is that says nothing for the interests of Sussex or Northumberland or Cumberland or Galloway or, you know, any of the constituent parts of Britain. Which is why I think you need a localized aristocracy, which is tied into the daily workings of his particular domain, or domain rather, who is then able to go to the country as a whole and sort of advocate on its behalf. So as you have someone with a foot in two worlds, in both worlds. You have someone rooted in the local, and that's where his power base and his strength comes from, and that's whom he has to satisfy overall. And then, sort of almost as a you know, as a collective, I believe that they will fulfill the role of the aggregate interest of Britain, you know, but not at the expense of their particular lordship, and you would have of their particular subjects, you know. And I think you would have a very tough time, like turning. I mean, just for as an extreme example, you know, turning Cumberland into a dumping ground, you know, to make room for you know, hotels in Northumberland. You'd never get. You're highly unlikely to get that if one, you know, devolve certain powers to prevent that sort of thing to the local lordship, whilst at the same time having that local lord in the region, and you know, he's able to sort of act on its behalf in the national body to speak out against it if it's not covered by his own jurisdiction within his regional, you know, assembly. And this could be, you know, said for like boroughs and things as well. I mean, there are, you know, plenty of people who will just be underrepresented for the area in which they live in, and to an extent, you know, there has to be something, because if we just go by the democratic route for like say county councils, right, the rich areas get, and Muslim areas frankly get lots of gibs, frankly, and that's not really fair, frankly. I think that, if you were to say you were to have like a baron in every borough, right?
Yes.
Well, then each borough is equally represented, so each borough has about as much chance to get, a particular resource as another. And also, you can sort of stop this degradation. So unlike the monarch, local lords don't have the option of like turning over laws. They sort of just have to follow the law of the land. And it's a long tradition of this. They're not sort of above the law in this sort of fanciful sense that you might see on TV. The lords themselves were the lords themselves are accountable to the laws of the land, and therefore you can have a constitution, complete with articles of association, which limit the lord's powers and give him certain obligations, legal obligations that he legally has to complete, or he can just literally automatically via the legal system be deposed, right, and be replaced. So that's sort of an added advantage to hereditary aristocracy that you can't necessarily make with all forms of monarchy, because they essentially are just bound by English law. And you can create incentives, you can create and disincentives that make the Lord want to make it in the Lord's interest to act in a way which is conducive to the population as a whole. So if you don't, and these are the examples that I'm going to use because this is what I would actually do. If you were to take the example, for instance, of our historic sites, which I think we'd both like to see preserved, in our churches, even the ones that aren't being used for their historical relevance, and our environmental sites. I don't want to see every nature reserve turned into a Tesco's. So if you want these things preserved, you can't trust a borough council. They'll sell it off in 5 minutes and use the money to go on a fact-finding trip to the Bahamas, if you let them. But rather, you can sort of include these as fixed assets, meaning sort of assets which can't be sold, as part of a local lordship. So as the local historical, cultural and environmental sites are forever bound legally to this lordship, and to this, as sort of property that's held by it and therefore must be maintained by it, but cannot be sold off because it's a fixed asset, and sort of no getting around that in English law. Now, of course, some people could say, oh, well, they could just legislate, the Parliament could legislate over it. Well, not if it's a codified constitution. That's so that's sort of the major advantage there. So I mean, and this must come as like a big sort of I've explained sort of the intricacies of my preferred system to you, in return to you doing the same. I'm sort of curious to think of what you make of that after just having heard it for the first time.
Yeah, I mean that's. I sort of largely agree with you. I think I would always stress that there's a degree of representation from the common people. I think having a House of Commons is a good thing. The sort of people who've ended up in it.
I'm terribly sorry for the interruption. I totally agree that we should have a House of Commons and that it should be, they should be appointed via the gentry. And I also believe in sort of greater regional participation. So, if you have devolved powers and, how to put this, in the manner in which the monarch traditionally oversees the government, but doesn't run every individual aspect of it. And there are particular restrictions placed upon that power. And there are certain duties, responsibilities, obligations thereof. I'm just advocating that on a smaller scale, so as the county council would still exist, but rather than a mayor that manages it, it would be a hereditary lord with, you know, a particular, you know, and I would also, to avoid sort of little litigious, you know, skullduggery, you know, on the part of any party trying to corrupt this, I would actually have like a template for the lordship, so as they're all the same, you know, so you can legally bind them to like not selling off the national park or, you know, the local castle or whatever it might be. But that in all other matters, you know, basically the local people will be running their own lives. It's merely, you know, I imagine some sort of veto power would be appropriate. And there will be some cases where you'll just see, you know, the Lord will be just like, you know, well, I'm legally bound to do this, and therefore I'm not going to let you sell off, you know, the national park. But for other matters, you know, traditionally, obviously, the monarch has to operate based on the support that the monarch has. And I'm advocating the same thing here. So as there are some things that the Lord has to do, there are some things they cannot do. And for everything else, they can do it or not. But if they misstep, then the local people should be able to, you know, extrude him and vote in a new lord. You know, preferably, I would say his son. But that's more of a cultural thing. That shouldn't, you know, I'm not suggesting that as a systemic sort of solution. But yeah, so the local people will be able to sort of force the Lord to abdicate or just get rid of him, you know. But that there should be, you know, but there are certain things that the Lord legally sort of has to do, and when he does those things, he is sort of legally, to put it, he, you know, he's legally obliged to do it, and therefore the people, you know, have no basis for trying to depose him based on that. Yeah. Okay. So, did you have any last thoughts? Because I know we are getting toward the end of the allotted time that we had for this hangout. Obviously, there will be a part 2. This is, you know, we've made tremendous ground here, I feel, and I'm really looking forward to finishing the rest of the conversation. Were there any final thoughts that you had there? Úrwiga, were there any final thoughts? Oh, okay. Yeah, mic issues right towards the end. Okay, it's just sent in the message, cheers for hosting. So I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I would like to thank Úrwiga for coming on. I very much look forward to the second part of this hangout very soon. Thank you, everyone. It's always a pleasure, never a chore.